I'm just hoping that my ear pops in the next 5 minutes because I can't hear anything. I've been switching constantly between no, just my right ear. I've been switching uh, between seasons like 3 times in the last 2 weeks, and I'm right now in Switzerland, and it's quite cold. So I managed to come down with it just a little bit. I'll be perfect by the time Omaha comes around, but.
But you switch seasons by going places. We're switching seasons just by staying exactly where we are. So Omaha may not be better for you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to OSA Backstage. I'm Dani Meyer. This is Hot Sauce. And on today's episode, Serena and I are talking with guest conductor, Maestro François López-Ferrer. So excited for François to join us. So excited for his Masterworks Week. Brahms 4 is the end all, be all, and we're going to talk about it. We also talk about his fascinating road to becoming a conductor, and also what changes as you get older and mature, and why every kid should be given a MacBook and some Logic Pro as they're growing up. I think you're going to love it. Enjoy. Thank you so much for doing this. Would you please introduce yourself?
So my name is François López-Ferrer, conductor, former assistant conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony, former Dudamel Fellow with the LA Phil, and former resident conductor of the Academy at the Paris Opera.
Awesome. Okay, all the former things, but what are you doing currently? Are you just guesting? Are you guesting all over the world? Are you putting roots down? What's your
Currently, I'm on the hamster wheel, just getting to know many different orchestras, different countries, and exploring, conducting lots of different rep of completely different styles, and enjoying myself because this is such a great experience to get to know so many different orchestras and get to do so many different types of music.
Where did music start for you then?
So I grew up in a musical family. My father was a conductor and my mother was a soprano. But it wasn't the typical upbringing because usually musical families, they tend to really be quite rigid with their children and make them, practice 4 or 5, 6 hours a day, whatever, the piano, the violin, or whatever it may be. In my case, I had a very well-rounded upbringing. I was very lucky. I played a lot of sports growing up. I played a lot of tennis. That's the sport that stuck with me throughout my life. I played hockey. I played basketball. I played piano. But I was quite a naughty student. You can ask my piano teacher because I hated practicing scales and I hated practicing the repertoire. I loved to sit and improvise. So that's where my sort of compositional background came about, because I loved just creating and discovering sounds in the moment.
Did your piano teacher ever remind you that most music is made up of scales and most improvisation, that everything is consisting of scales and chords? Did she ever try, or he ever try that angle, or did they just kind of leave you to your own devices at that point?
She was always a little bit disappointed. She was always a little disappointed, but she's very happy how things have turned out in the long run.
So
At the
what?
tender age of 93 now.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Okay, so you were already improvising, you were already trying things out. But what was that? Was there a catalyst point for you to go into composition at school?
Well, actually, when I was around 12 or 13, I loved computers and I loved technology. And I always wanted to be up to date and get the newest computer, the fastest computer. And now I don't even know what's going on anymore. As long as my iPhone works, I'm happy. But at that time there was Pro Tools and there was Logic Pro, which was by Apple. They were two recording softwares, and specifically Logic Pro with Apple came with a huge amount of different sounds, synthetic sounds, synthesizers, and I would just sit there for hours until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, writing, coming up with songs, with instrumentals, and so that led me into music production, which in turn was very useful as a conductor, because from an early age, I mean, of course, I was still playing piano, but there you're reading just 2 lines. But when you're using those recording softwares, you're seeing all of the lines and manipulating each line in real time. And that's essentially what you're doing as a conductor. You're constantly balancing and finding new colors in each of those lines and blending them together. I would sit for hours with friends, record everything from rock music to samba to reggaeton to R&B to hip hop. And that's sort of where I thought I was going until I met my first composition professor, who taught me this entirely new world, which was in a way very similar. And I thought this would be the best way to go into music, because I wasn't sure in what direction I wanted to go into, whether it was music production, engineering, if it was film music, but I loved the creative process. So really that's how it came about, and it was a very fluid transition into the world of conducting in many ways, and I'm glad that I had that background, because I started out from a very young age looking at the big picture of things. Whereas as an instrumentalist, you're focusing on one or two lines, and you're focusing on the technique. You're focusing on something very singular, and then the challenge is how to look at things from the larger architectural perspective.
What was the new direction that your first composition teacher pointed you in? Was he?
Well, his name is Sean Pebolo. And I think you've probably performed some of his music as well.
I listened to a bunch over the weekend, because he came up in another interview you did, and I was really curious that there was like a single person who kind of did the shift for you.
Well, the reason why we clicked so early on is because he also had an incredibly wide array of interests musically, and in so many different musical genres. At that time, I know he really liked minimalism, and he got me into Steve Reich and Philip Glass. And that I really liked, because it was very connected with the kind of pop music that I was doing, because pop music is basically minimalist music. It's 4 bars repeated, and then you have a introduction, a chorus, and a bridge, and an outro, and it repeats this way. So that was that's he brought me into that world, and we really connected because of that. And also he got me into let's say, how would you call this? Electronic music, but not in the pop sense. I mean, classically oriented electronic music, where it was just music that had no structure, but just sounds, the exploration of sounds. And so you see, there's all this connection between this recording software and then developing my own ideas. And going from bigger to smaller, and then smaller to bigger. These ideas of limited materials, and how to develop them into something much larger. Which, looking at the composers, some of which we'll talk about today and on the program, and all of them did the same. They used limited materials that then grew out in this huge ocean of sound.
And so, what was that was still like, you're still in your undergrad. You're at Cincinnati, and you're in your undergrad, and you're going this direction. And then you decide to take a choral conducting course. And I'm trying to rectify the distance between traditional choral conducting and going absolutely nuts in this other direction of minimalist music and electronic music and composition.
Well, I grew up where every Saturday, I mean, by the time I was an adolescent, my mom had gone in a different direction. She had given up singing, but I always had my piano lesson, and my piano teacher, who was also an accompanist, she would stay for another 30 minutes or an hour, and she would she would do that first with my mother. She would do a kind of voice lesson, and I woke up every Saturday to either Vici d'Arte from Tosca or Si mi chiamano Mimi from Bohème, and that was my alarm clock in the morning. So voice was always something that I associate with a bit my DNA. And my father was also a huge opera conductor. And then I always sang in choirs during high school, and then during college as well. And then during my undergrad, one of the requirements was you had to take some kind of conducting course, either instrumental or choral. But given my background in choral music and in singing, in voice, I decided to go into choral conducting. And I just remember the first time that I stood in front of my colleagues It was 16 people in the class. It was Handel's Zadok the Priest. And I remember just shivering of excitement. There was a bit of fear involved because, you're getting in front of a group of people, and it's like a bit like public speaking, but you're doing it with your hands, and you don't know how people are reacting to you. If you look funny, if you're doing it right, if it makes any sense, if you're communicating, what's in the music or not. It was a surreal experience, and I just felt in that moment that this was the direction I had to go into, because I'm by nature a very social being, and the problem with composition is that it's an extremely lonely profession. I always feel there's of course some composers who conduct their own music and conduct others' music, but for the majority of them, they compose, they come to the hall and give their notes to the conductor and to the musicians who are realizing their works. But I've always found that a little bit sad. It wasn't for me. And the hours of being alone and not having that moment of catharsis. I'm happy to sit for hours alone with a score of music, but then there's the moment of catharsis in rehearsal, and then the performances and the preparation that goes into it, and then the audience. You add their reactions to that. I need that festivity at the end to celebrate the process of learning a piece of music.
You're an introvert by choice, but you're an extrovert by necessity.
Precisely.
Okay. What was that?
Actually, no, I'm an extrovert by choice, but an introvert by necessity, because I have to spend that time alone to learn the music, and then a natural extrovert in that sense.
What was that like looking at that Handel score? Was there something, was it kind of like, oh, I already know how to do this, like you said, because you've already spent so much time with your own works?
That's a good point. I mean, it was so hard to describe, because you see these notes written on the page, and then you have no idea how they're going to sound in the end. I mean, you have these voices that are completely different in front of you, and you have to find this way to blend them together. In this case, it was a conducting course, so we weren't really supposed to rehearse. We had to just do it with our hands and make sure we were clear. So it was more of a technical exercise than anything else. And that adds a whole different layer to it, because rehearsing is a whole different art from just the technical aspect of things. The technical aspect is difficult at first, but then becomes much easier. But the rehearsal aspect of things is by far the most complicated, because then you add psychology, you add human connections, and you have to find the right words to use, to find the right moment to say certain things, and to go into the music in a way that's gradual and effective.
So since you grew up with your father, with being a conductor, and then of course the choral part, it sounds like a lot of that would feel intuitive, but that of course with rehearsing being a complicated process, but also being an extrovert, I'm sure some things are quite easy and intuitive. Is there anything that you find does come easily, and something that was unexpected that didn't come so easily as you're starting this choral conducting? Like, I don't know, did you feel like your technique was almost already there because you were just exposed to conducting from such an early age?
Not really, because I think the technique that I had later on a Russian teacher who and the Russians really have a school of, I mean, the way they conduct, it's like the way they play an instrument. There's so much meaning between the beats. Whereas maybe some other schools are more about clarity and about being just functional. So I feel like the technique was something that really took time to develop, and I like to think I've done a good job at learning from that school and employing it in my own way, because in the end, this is a very personal musical language. I mean, no two conductors look alike, and no two conductors should look alike. We should all be different, because we all have different physicalities. We all have different faces, different emotions. What did come easy for me, because I've always approached music from a very emotional perspective, from an emotional point of view. So the spontaneity in music was always something that came easy to me. What I had to do the opposite where I had to really focus on was becoming more scientific about it, because there's a lot of objectivity in music, and then there's this kind of indescribable part that's extremely subjective. But in terms of how to establish tempo relationships, how to build the architecture of a piece, you can't just say, oh wow, this is the moment that's the loudest, so it's the climax. No, maybe it's not the most important climax of the work. So those are very scientific, so sort of objective scientific ways to approach music. And I think it's important to have not a little bit, but a lot of each, to trust your musical instinct, but that instinct be backed up by something theoretical.
Did that theoretical background also come really early on as someone interested in composition, and piano being so tactile and visually, helpful in terms of theory? Was that something that also was integrated intuitively, or were you taught lessons? Did you have to take courses kind of later on to
Oh, of
take
course. I mean,
them?
we all take our theory courses, our history
Yes.
courses, and so forth. But the moment that you get in front of an orchestra, so much of that goes away, and that has to become your musical instinct. Those two things have to unite, because you're immediately in front of a large group of people, and you don't have a lot of time to think. It's all happening in the moment. You're living constantly in the moment, in the past, what just happened, and in the future. And you have these three things happening. So there's a lot going on in your head, and you can't think what you can't pre-calculate what you're going to say, but you have to constantly be aware of what's coming and what just happened, so that, especially in rehearsal, because then you have to remember what's gone wrong and how to fix it. But that sort of more objective aspect, that theoretical aspect, has to sort of unite with your musical instinct, and that's the challenge that takes years. I mean, that doesn't happen just in a bachelor's or a master's. I mean, those are things that, they always say you're a young conductor until you're 60, and then when you're 60, you actually know something about conducting. So I hope I'm on the right track, and I'm certainly doing my best to unite all of the different aspects: the psychological aspect, the musical aspect, the spontaneity, all of the different facets of music making.
And of course, none of these pieces exist in a vacuum. So would you argue that whatever scientific approach you've put into each individual piece, do things change when you put them together in a program?
Of course, because in the end, these pieces live and breathe. So I mean, I have my father studied with Hans Swarovski in Vienna, and I see these scores, and let's take the classical repertoire more specifically. So Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Hans Swarovski had always a very clear tempo, a very clear relationship between, let's say, if there's a slow introduction and then an allegro, he always came up with this very, very clear tempo relationship. And in the end, it's approximative, because it lives and breathes in the moment. And some days you may need the music to be a little faster, a little slower. Maybe the tempo, it doesn't, maybe it's cold outside, and you need to warm up the finger, so it needs to go a little faster, or it can be a whole bunch of different aspects. So of course it has to live and breathe in the moment. I mean, theory is just theory. Practicality is what it's human. And we're all human, and this is what we're performing. We're striving for perfection, a perfection that we'll never achieve. But in the strive for that, it creates this sense of devotion to music, of always striving for the best, but never really arriving at that. And that's why these pieces stay alive, and that's why we come back to them, we re-record them, we try and perform them the way period practice, the way that they sounded at the time they were written, or try and change completely the aesthetic, or recontextualize them with modern instruments, or even electronic instruments, or whatever it may be. But the music breathes and lives in the moment.
Okay, so that's a perfect seg into the bookends of our program that you're doing with us in just a few weeks, actually, because you have Un Suk Chin opening the program with Subito con Forza, and then you have Brahms for closing the program. And something Serena and I have talked about a lot is Brahms and Schumann giving him the mantle of congrats, you're the new Beethoven, deal with it. Which 20 years of anxiety later, he would finally deal with it. But when Beethoven's 250th birthday came around in 2020, and you had all these composers trying to pay homage to Beethoven by using his music or being inspired by his music, what lens do you even start with when you look at someone like Un Suk Chin or Brahms? Are you coming from where they are? Are you coming from what they were inspired by? Where are you starting with that music?
First of all, just, the fact that it was premiered in 2020, it's sort of fitting that the pandemic hit exactly on Beethoven's 250th anniversary year, because this was somebody who if you've seen pictures, a little bit about his story. He wasn't the nicest gentleman. He was extremely. It was an intensive labor for him to compose music. He was very insistent, and that's what's behind the title, Subito con Forza. So he has sforzati all over his music, more than any other of the other composers at the time. It's very insistent music. He's trying to make a statement. He's trying to show his place in the world and send this message along of humanity, of freedom. But I never really look so much at music from a chronological sense, but more because music history, it's not so much a sequence of styles or of genres, but it's this interconnected web of relationships, admiration, and influence. And this program is perfect for that, because you see the influence that Beethoven had on Un Suk Chin, and then you see and then of course Beethoven on Brahms, and then Clara Schumann on Brahms, and Brahms on Clara Schumann, who had a very close relationship, of course. So it's the first Facebook, it's the first social network. All of the greatest music, whether it's written today or written 300 years ago, it all is connected to the past, or it makes a very clear and purposeful break from the past, but aware of the past, and that's important. So if you look at the Second Viennese School, for example, Schoenberg, Webern, Alban Berg, they decided to completely break from the past, but they did it knowingly. It's not just, okay, I don't care what happened before us, but I'm just going to write whatever comes to mind, So that's what all the greatest music does, and even in pop music today, you have lots of artists who do that. They bring the past into their music, and it's always interconnected. Whether we're talking about the Who, the Beatles, or Beyonce, it's all they're all somehow they're feeding off of each other from the past.
And if they don't admit that, then usually people can find it for them. Like, I remember the Olivia Rodrigo and her album coming out, and Courtney Love being like, "Hi, hello, that's my cover," and she whether she knew it or not, she gathered all these influences in her writing, and so you could see the lineage. So either you do it knowingly, or you find out. You are told what you have taken.
There's a fine line between plagiarism and influence and admiration. Mm-hmm. I can think of at least two songs on Abbey Road, because the world is round, or You Never Give Me Your Money, and Because is the Moonlight Sonata. It's very similar. It's in the exact same key. It's in C sharp minor, and it's a very similar progression. And then you have Because the World is Round, which is just a series of descending fifths, and then a cadence, and that's Vivaldi. It's completely Vivaldi. Bum bum bim bum bim bum bum bum. So and I don't know if they knowingly did it, but it's if anything, it's still subconscious, because it did exist before you. Those are the sounds that we're exposed to, and that's influence. Influence is, regardless if we know it or not, it's all around us. And sometimes you can't explain it, why you like something or not, but it's something that you've grown up with. In the case of Un Suk Chin, it's really peculiar, because this is an homage piece. It's not an arrangement or anything of that nature. It starts out with a direct quotation of Coriolan overture. Bum, bum. But when you get this rhythmic burst of a chord, bum, bum, you have the percussion that just, this burst of energy. It feels like you're standing outside of a church and the church windows, they collapse, they just break, and the glass breaks down, and then you hear an orchestra performing Beethoven inside. So it's really echoes of Beethoven more than direct quotations. And then aside from that Coriolan direct quotation, all of the others are hidden away. There's a little bit of Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto, there's Beethoven 5, there's a little bit of the Ninth Symphony. There are moments that even sound like Stravinsky in the middle of the piece, but it's only 5 minutes long, and you have these really stark contrasts between bursts of rhythmic energy and these delicate contrasts. But it's a very spooky piece in many ways. You really see almost Beethoven's soul coming back to life and haunting us for 5 minutes in the hall, and it's the perfect way to establish to kick off a program that then is music from contemporaries, Brahms and Schumann and Clara Schumann.
I love that. I love the idea of, it's not an homage in the sense of it always has to be celebratory. It's an homage rather in like the spirit in which his music was written, and something as somber and as tense as Coriolan starting everything off. How then where do we want the audience to go from between Unsuk-jin's piece and the Clara Schumann, which is such a glorious left turn, but it's a real left turn into something that is delightful and virtuosic and like sunshine and daisies in a way.
I mean, Beethoven was the link. He was the bridge from the classical tradition to the Romantic tradition, and none of those composers would have thought to romanticize music if it hadn't been because of Beethoven. Beethoven's music was about the soul, about the human condition, about the human spirit, and about the person, not about perfection and beauty and symmetry as the Enlightenment ideals that influenced the classical period, Haydn, Mozart, and so forth. And this is really music that's incredibly personal. And what with Clara Schumann, what's so amazing, she was just 13 years old when she wrote it, and it was premiered when she was 15. And you see such an incredible maturity and such a cleverness also, just in terms of how she chooses her harmonies. In the classical tradition, you have to, if you have certain rules about how to get from one key center to another, and Clara sort of cheekily avoids that. I mean, you have this piano concerto that's in A minor with a second movement that's in A flat minor. So that's not important, but what's important to understand is that it's a very dissonant relationship between the two. It's much more dissonant than any other key relationships in other symphonies of her contemporaries at the time, who were already doing things like Berlioz, who was doing already crazy harmonic things. But in many ways, it has a traditional structure, but it's 3 movements played attacca, and with a structure of one movement, of a one movement sonata, where the second movement is a cadenza. And I have to say, on a personal level, it's the most difficult movement to do for me, the second movement, because it's only for piano solo and for a cello solo that comes in at the tail end. And I don't get to conduct it. So you're sitting there and you want to participate in this music making, and you all you have to do is point to the cello, and that's my whole participation there. But she was born 9 years after Chopin, and she was one of the figures that popularized Chopin's music. Clara was more than anything a performer. She gave up really composing. She limited her composing to dedicate herself to her husband Robert Schumann, the composer, of course, and her family. but she performed always throughout her life. She was the more well-known of the two in the marriage. And you hear a lot of Chopin in this music. It's a lot of embellishments. It's a lot of ornamentation, and you see a lot of that influence. And you see this clear. There's a lot of similarity in the harmonic language between her and her husband, but you have this very much more free approach in Clara's piano concerto. And funny enough, both are in the same key of A minor. But Clara's is a little bit more insistent because the first and third movements are in minor and it finishes in minor, whereas Robert Schumann's piano concerto is also in A minor, starts in A minor, but it finishes in A major. So you have this sort of voyage from darkness to light in a way. Whereas with Clara, for somebody who was so young, she had this incredibly fiery, passionate side to her that she wanted to show to the world. And interestingly, for somebody who had such an incredible career, to really come out with this statement in Leipzig, it was premiered by Felix Mendelssohn conducting the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, and she writes this concerto that is a statement of who she is as a person, as a young, incredibly brilliant and talented young woman.
And there are so many people who have brilliant careers in their youth, and yet they don't retain that level of respect and reputation as they get older. And yet we can see with her and Robert's relationship with Brahms that absolutely was not the case because of how close they stayed and how much influence the two of them had on each other. So what then is what's the mindset of going into the second half, knowing that we've kind of been tracing this lineage of these centuries from Beethoven and Clara Schumann and Robert Schumann now to Johannes Brahms, who would kind of keep carrying them forward? Where do we go from there, basically?
Brahms 4 is essentially a synthesis of music history. In fact, when his symphonies were premiered, a lot of them didn't get positive reviews because they were too similar to Beethoven. Everybody was always comparing him to Beethoven, which he suffered from. I mean, he knew that, but he suffered from that because he wanted to be his own composer, and because the structures are very, very classical, but the harmonies and the rhythmic freedom in his music is relatively novel for its time. You have this dichotomy going on in his music constantly. But Brahms 4 is really this synthesis of all different styles, from Baroque music, Bach, to Beethoven, to and to Brahms. The three Bs, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. And he's the successor to all of them, to the point where even the fourth movement, for example, is based on a cantata of Bach called Mein Herr verlanget mich. So I long for you, dear Lord, which is interesting because this is the last symphony he composed, and he was getting ready to leave the world. He didn't leave it for another 12 years, but this was kind of his last big statement. And then he composed a few more chamber works toward the end of his life, but he basically left it. I mean, he was sort of ready to leave this world. And this piece, one is a synthesis of music history, but also as a synthesis of one's life. It's a retelling of life's ups and downs, of contemplation, of acceptance, and of fear as well, fear of the unknown. And that's where I'd like the audience to also be at this place when we start the symphony, to reflect on where they are, at which point they find themselves in their lives, regardless of age or background, because this piece really it tells you a lot about yourself and where you are. And this is what attracts me to it, because I'm 35 now. I did it for the first time when I was as a student, technically, but really the first time I did it, I was 20, 25, 26. And it was going back to what I was talking about earlier, the emotional approach to music. My approach was entirely emotional. And I remember I was exhausted after the performance. And it was, but I was so happy with how it went. Wow, it just took over me. I was just shivering and happy and sad and so many different emotions at the same time. But it was the wrong way to approach, because that's a very youthful, a young person's way to approach such a deep and significant work of music. It requires a lot of reflection and building and understanding how to get from A to B and from B to C. you know um but again, coming back to this piece, now that I've done it quite a few times, each time I feel like it uncovers, it reminds me of where I'm at in my maturity as a person, how I feel about things, how I feel about perspectives in life, and just where I'm at personally. And that's what I would like for the audience to also have in their mind. It's music. This music is as poetic as it is touching. So whether it relates a story to you or reminds you of something that happened in your life, or if it's just simply more from a removed perspective, just appreciate it from a touching way, from just an from its sheer beauty. It's there's a lot there. And it's always about, there's certain pieces in music. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, let's take an example. That's a piece, it's a genius piece of music, but we all have heard it when we were kids, and that piece brings us back to when we were kids. But it doesn't, maybe for some people, but it's not really the kind of a piece that has a much deeper message than what it is. So it takes you back. It reminds me of when you were a kid. Maybe you saw Fantasia, or just reading, seeing cartoons and so forth. And but it doesn't grow with you and tell you something about yourself, maybe, or maybe it does. But I don't want to judge for other people. But there's certain works, and Brahms, his four symphonies are like that, but especially the fourth, that tell you so much about yourself. And each time it's different. Each time it's deeper.
So that's interesting. So you said two things that really fascinate me. One, you said it was, when you first did it, you did it, quote, wrong, because you approached it from such a youthful standpoint. But I also wonder, it's like, yes, when we do come back to things, I feel like there are ghost memories of the first time you ever did it, or the first time you ever heard it, and it's very difficult to shake that. It's like the first time even you tried a different food or something, right? It will always be locked in, that core memory, and then you have to build on top of that. So wrong strikes me as the wrong word, because you couldn't necessarily have done it any other way in that moment, but you still have that ghost memory of having done it that way your first time. And so now it's the conscious effort to uncover more and try it differently, or to see more, maybe.
But I would use a different. It's not a conscious effort. It shouldn't be conscious. You can't.
Okay.
You can't. I mean, in a sense, I can't deliberately be more mature in this moment, right? I can't decide to become more mature. It's something that has to come naturally. Of course,
Okay.
you make a conscious effort to develop yourself as a person and learn more and make the right decisions and so forth. But you can't decide right now, I'm going to be mature and do this a certain way, or because then that's pretending. Especially with any music, but especially a Brahms symphony, it has to be very honest. It has to be very honest. It has to come from where you are, and if not, people
So
will hear.
yeah, so the honesty is what I'm saying. It's like, it
And that's what
was,
you're saying. That's true.
you
Yeah, I
could
see.
argue that
Sure.
it was honest. It was you honestly at 25, 26, and now will be you honestly now. And in 10 years, do you think you will look back at your next however many Brahms fours you get to do, and will you think, oh, well, that was honestly me at 35, but now at 45,
I hope so, because then it would, if I in 10 years I listen to a recording of a Brahms four that I did at 35, and it sounds good to me or mature, then I'm doing something wrong, because that means I'm not growing.
As speaking of recordings, have you noticed like your favorite recordings change throughout
Yeah.
time as well?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. I feel like when the older you get, there's a reason why things become slower. You know.
Well, they
Yeah,
usually say it's because your heart rate is slowing down as you get
could
older,
be.
your sense of tempo. They say, "Oh, and then everything gets slower." But do you have a different theory?
It could be. It could be. No, but I think, look, this is very Celibidachian, okay? But Celibidache was this Romanian conductor who was notorious for doing everything quite slowly. But whether or not one agrees with that, and in this case, it's a bit exaggerated, but um, tempo is space. So whether from A to B, there's less space or more space. But when you create space, you create the time to absorb and you create the time to develop meaning. Because if you just go through something, if I go and speak really fast, you didn't really understand, but I said something, right? But if I take my time to enunciate, then there's more meaning in my words. And it's the same thing in music. And music is a language. And how you communicate something needs to have the right pacing. Or if I speak really slowly and separate words, it has no meaning. Then it just becomes you're like trying to pick up things. So you have to find uh, the right pacing in music, and that's why tempo is also a very going back again to what we were talking about Swarovski and tempo relationships. You have to find the right pacing in the moment, and it depends on so many different factors, because again, music is human, and we need the time to understand it, and depending on also your age and where you are at in life. When I first listened to some of the older recordings, the George Zell, Karajan, of like Beethoven symphonies um, and the Brahms symphonies, it was too slow for me. I just didn't know. I needed some speed. I needed a little bit of velocity. Get me, take me somewhere. Um, so it's yeah, it's an interesting question. Tempo is space, and space gives you the time to develop meaning into what you're saying, whether it be through language or through the music, the language of music as well.
Have your favorite composers also changed as you've gotten older? Are there specific composers you relate to more?
Now, I feel like there's certain composers that I didn't connect with growing up that now I connect with, either am beginning to appreciate or really appreciate already. Bruckner is somebody I never connected with growing up. This was my father's favorite composer. And just to tell you a little bit, um, my father was going to be a priest until he was 16 or 17. He was in the seminary to become a priest, and then he left. And then that was also the best way to get an education in the middle 20th century in southern Spain. But anyway, so it's very, devout music. It's very reflective. That was not me at all growing up. I mean, I just a brief little thing about me. I mean, I was born in Switzerland. That's why I have a French name, but I'm not French at all. My parents had the idea that I was going to be raised in Switzerland, so that's what often the Swiss do. They give their kids a French or a German name or whatever. But then I grew up in the States. But my mother was Cuban. She came to New York from the just before the Bay of Pigs in the 60s, and my father was Spanish. But that Latino influence is really, really big in my life. And I also lived a few years in Miami, which is like there's more Cubans in Miami than there are in Cuba. So it's that was um, a big influence of mine. So what were we saying? This was connected to something important.
Bruckner and your
To,
dad.
to Bruckner. So the first music that really I connected with was music that was rhythmic. So I loved Latin American composers. I loved Tina Stera, Revueltas. I loved, Marquez and so forth. Stravinsky. I mean, these were the composers that really I connected with. Ravel, Debussy, not because of its velocity or anything, but Debussy's music is so colorful and there's so much happening at the same time. So there's a lot of even though a lot of Debussy's music it's slower and has a lot of space involved, but there's a lot of information there coming at you. So that I really connected with. But rhythm was really the first thing that attracted me to music. I feel like as I get older, it becomes more about progression and harmonic development as opposed to just the rhythm, you know.
So yeah, Bruckner with the longest harmonic
Right.
progressions. Okay, so that's interesting. And you, quick left turn. So you were born in Switzerland, grew up in the States. How you speak 6 languages fluently. So they are
So
English, French.
yeah, I mean, so it's kind of it's not that so straightforward because I was born in Switzerland. French was my first language. I only spoke French and a little bit of Spanish at home until I was 6. Then I moved to the States. I completely forgot French. I still spoke Spanish growing up, but it was really Spanglish because, you know, we Latino families in the States, it's especially the ones who try to keep the tradition alive, but there is inevitably a lot of influence from what's around you, you know, so everything is in English, so it becomes it's almost like in Miami it's like we speak a dialect. We spoke a dialect at the time. It was Spanglish. It was really, there's people who tried to now make the argument that it's become a dialect, Spanglish, and it's very fascinating to hear because you'll see, like, you know, I remember I was once just in a restaurant and I was listening to the lady near me. I was probably 15 and she was saying, like, you know, "Ay, este summer vamos a ir de vacation." I was like, "What is happening here?" You know, it's charming. It's very charming, you know, because especially coming from a place like Switzerland. I'm here now. Actually, I'm in the. I don't live here anymore, but I live in Italy. But I'm in just north of Bern in Bid Solothurn, and you just hear all of these languages around you constantly. So it's and dialects of those languages. You know, they speak a dialect of German. It's kind of a dialect of French as well, but not as stark of a dialect as it is between German and Swiss German. But so I always found that very charming growing up in the States. But I didn't really speak Spanish that well until I turned about 18. So after high school, I did my undergrad and I started spending more time in Switzerland. I had a German stepmother, and with them they only spoke in German, and she spoke English okay, but she was very comfortable in German, and dinners at home were always, our time spent together would last about 30 seconds in English, and then the rest of the conversation was in German. So I used that as a motivation to just pick up a book. I took a course at the University of Cincinnati in German, an immersive course where I learned absolutely nothing in 1 year. And because I don't learn through immersion. I'm somebody who needs to layer things, also in the way I learn music and everything. So I took a grammar book, and it's 300 pages. It's called German Made Simple. It describes everything and just repeat it over and over. I am, you are, he is, ich bin, du bist, er ist, wir sind, ihr seid, sie sind. And then, and just did that with all of the verbs, learned all of the tenses and everything. And then through that, I went back and corrected my Spanish, because then we all take English growing up in the grammar, but we don't remember it, from school, maybe, what an adverb is, or what a conjunction is, or, the indicative and the subjunctive and so forth. We forget all of those things, but I relearned it and then corrected my Spanish. I relearned French. And then I spent the first 5 years of my career were in Chile, in South America. And I conducted a bit around in South America, in Brazil. I loved samba and bossa nova growing up. I loved the poetry behind the music. So when I got my first invitation to conduct in Brazil, I just took the book and, learned it relatively quickly. And yeah, so that's how they've come about. But it's not because I grew up around them. I think the early exposure was very good because I have a pretty decent, I still have an accent in the way I speak those languages, but not like super thick or anything. So I think having that exposure early on, and that's why early exposure to classical music is so important, because you get the sound in you, and that's how you come to love music. And that's a whole different conversation about music education, but that it's connected.
But that sounds also so much like what you were doing when you were messing around with Logic Pro. That you were finding all the different sounds that you could possibly make and how you could layer them together and structure them and put them together just right. And then meeting Sean, and it sounds like you have you have found these cross sections of all the things that you love, and you use them to improve yourself at other things. So
But yeah,
yeah.
and I mean, but growing up like that is difficult because I've had always been jealous of friends who grew up in a small village in the middle of Spain, and they know everything from that village. They know the people, they know the food, they know how to cook that food, they know the dialects, and then or growing up in the States, someone like me, I was switching schools a lot and kind of a bit all over the place. So that lack of identity was a struggle growing up, and now it's a huge blessing. I mean, I'm so lucky that when I do an opera, and I will tell you, I will never do an opera in a language that I don't speak. Or if I don't have a year with nothing to do to learn that language, I won't do it because that's so much of what the opera is. It's not just the music, and it has to have, you have to give meaning to those words and connect it to the music. So I mean, I can open up a Wagner opera and I don't have to I have to translate maybe, it's a lot of the terms are archaic. So maybe, 30%, but I don't have to sit and transliterate and then transliterate and translate and then memorize. And, it's so much more natural, and it's a beautiful thing, especially with Italian opera. I mean, I've been living in Italy now for the last 7 years or so. And it's a whole different thing when you do Rossini or when you do Donizetti or Puccini. I mean, you approach it from a whole different perspective because you don't ask yourself those things. A layer of and a very important layer of that music is already taken care of.
This might be a bit of a tangent, but is there something our audience could listen to in advance of your program with us that would kind of be like their language primer?
Bach, just any Bach. Listen to a chorale, listen to a cantata, because that's always a good. There's a famous conductor, Ivan Fischer, and rumor has it that with his Budapest Festival Orchestra, he very often starts rehearsals with an arrangement of a Bach chorale, because it just cleans up everything. It cleans up intonation. It cleans up. It warms you up, and it just purifies your mind and your soul. And then he'll move on to the Mahler Symphony, because all of that comes from there. And one thing I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but the Brahms 4, there's the famous Passacaglia, which I mentioned was from the Bach cantata. But it's the Passacaglia. It's an Italian term, but it's actually originally a Spanish dance from the 17th century. And it literally means pasa calle, so a step on the street, a street dance, and it's a street dance in 3. And the difference between that and a chaconne, which is very similar, but it's a little bit more of a darker, more aggressive street dance, which is interesting because there's a lot of aggression in that movement. It's 30 variations and a coda, and it's this constant transformation throughout, but it's just that theme that's repeated over and over, and it's so funny that he decides to end his symphonic output rendering homage not to Beethoven but to Bach. He's the abuelo, the grandfather of everybody.
That's so much. I love that so much. Okay, this has been amazing, and we only have a few minutes left. So this is the question we give everybody. If you had 30 minutes on stage with no consequences and you could try anything, what would you do?
It's a funny question. So it's not like what I could conduct or something. It's just what I could do on stage.
Any instrument, what would you conduct? It could be anything.
But there's an orchestra. There could be an orchestra.
There could be, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's interesting. I'm very fascinated with Jacob Collier. I find what this guy does he really is the Mozart of our time in so many ways. If Mozart were alive today, he would be doing that. And one of the things that I've really been taken by is his improvisations with audiences, because you have people. I mean, think about just when you have, you know, an audience saying happy birthday and how many different tonalities you have. And this guy gets in front of these audiences and just with one single note builds these harmonies that develop into Mullerian progressions, because he knows exactly how to get them to feel the harmony in the right way. And it's just something I don't understand, but it's beautiful and I really appreciate it. But if I could, I wouldn't copy him, of course. I mean, he's already done this. But what I would love to do is just, without saying a word, with certain gestures, maybe a certain look, or with my hands, just try and create an improvisation with an orchestra and see what would come of that. Or even better, involve the audience in that, whether it be by speaking out certain adjectives or certain sounds, not words, but sounds, that then the orchestra recreates, and see if we could build a piece around that in 30 minutes and just kind of manipulate the sound, just see what comes out. You know, I remember there was one exercise, I don't remember what note we fell on, but this was really interesting. In a composition course, we were like 20 of us in a room, and we all had to pick a note, and we just started singing that note. And we were there for about 15 minutes, and we had to find one note at the end. We didn't know where we were going, but we all chose a note. It was just a cluster of cluster harmony, cluster chord, and then we all ended up on the same note at the end. I think it was a G or something, but it was something common. It wasn't like an F sharp or something. It was something like a C or a G or a D. And it's point being that, you know, when you, certain gestures create inherently a certain set of meanings to them, and I'm curious how an orchestra would react to that, and how an audience would react to that, you know?
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. You're the first person to suggest that. So that would be like one massive thought experiment, just with instruments and with audience engagement potentially.
Or the easy response, frankly, would be I would just do the first act of Tosca. It's amazing.
I like your first answer better.
And that's about 50 minutes long, so it's work in 30 minutes. I can do the Tedeum and I'll be happy.
Speed run Tosca. Throw out everything you said about tempo and space and just speed run. Oh, Francois, thank you so much.
And I'm so looking forward to coming back to Omaha. I had such a great time last time. I remember we did a Mozart 39 that just felt like it lasted 5 minutes long. Maybe my tempi were too fast, but really that's, you know, Mozart should be like that. It should feel like by the time you got to the end, it just was like a breeze. And that's how it felt with them. They were so energetic and so cultivated about their approach to it. And it was a Mozart 39 that I'll never forget. And I'm really looking forward to doing a whole different repertoire with them this time and getting to know the Holland Center.
Yes. Oh, we're looking forward to having you. It's going to be an awesome week. So.
It will be. I'm very much looking forward. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'll see you in a little bit. I'll make sure to bring the right attire for the weather.
Bring different outfits for about 4 different seasons, and you should be good.
Precisely.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Serena. Take care.
See you soon.